For today's video, we'll be taking a slight detour from the 1940s or earlier, and returning to the Cold War. This period is an interesting one, and generally ignored by naval history YouTubers, although I've done a couple videos on the time frame myself. Today's video will look at a ship that straddles the line, in this case, USS Ernest G Small, a Gearing-class destroyer laid down and launched the year Japan surrendered. Too late to see combat there. However, this meant that Small was retained by the post-war Navy, and that she would see action in the Korean War instead. That said, we'll get to that. First, let's look at where this ship started. In this case, at the Bath Iron Works shipyard on January 30th, 1945. The destroyer was laid down as the Second World War approached its end. Germany was on its last legs, and Japan wasn't far behind. However, this didn't slow down construction on Ernest G Small, not even slightly. American industry was still running at full tilt, and destroyers were still being pumped out at ludicrous speed. In her case, Small would launch on June 14, 1945. Not even 6 months after the keel was laid, and she would commission on August 21st, a couple months later, which is after the Japanese surrender, and is, of course, why this ship missed combat in the Pacific War. That would have to wait a few years, which gives us time to briefly cover the design. As said earlier, Small was a Gearing-class destroyer. While not as famous as the Fletcher class, this is a pretty well-known ship, arguably the best American destroyer to come out of the Second World War. These were highly capable warships, and would serve for quite a long time in various navies. Displacing around 2,600 tons at their standard load, the gearings were pretty large by destroyer standards. This rose even higher on the full load, to around 3,500 tons. On that displacement, the ship carried a heavy loadout for a destroyer, 6 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 3 twin mountings, 127mm for the metric audience. These were carried in a fairly typical layout, 2 mounts on the bow in a super firing arrangement, and the third mount all the way on the stern. To support those guns, Small also carried 5 21-inch torpedoes, and a single quintuple launcher mounted amidships. The Gearing class initially carried 10 in 2 quintuple mounts. However, on most of the ships, the aft torpedo mount, just above the stern 5-inch guns, was removed, and replaced by more anti-aircraft guns to counter kamikazes. You can see that here in 1946. That anti-aircraft battery started out with the usual 20mm and 40mm gun spam. By the time this photo was taken, that had shifted to the new 3-inch gun. This varied from ship to ship and on the exact time period, but it typically went from a single twin mount up to 6 barrels in all, in 2 twin and 2 single mounts. The final weaponry, then, would have been depth charges and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. As for the speed, that was fairly impressive. A top speed of around 37 knots on 60,000 shaft horsepower, through 2 shafts. And with that rounding off the design, we can return to service, which began fairly quietly, as you can imagine. The Japanese had surrendered on August 15th. While the formal surrender ceremony wouldn't come until September 2nd, that hardly mattered for USS Ernest G Small. With no enemy to fight, the destroyer went in for her shakedown cruise. This lasted into early 1946, with the destroyer finishing it by January of that year. As a result, she could set sail for Europe on January 11th to take up duty in the Mediterranean. Small would stay in that general area until August 7th before returning home, where the destroyer would take up service in the Atlantic, operating out of New London, Connecticut. This would go without major issue at first. However, as 1946 shifted to 1947, Small would have her first bout of poor luck. On April 3rd of 1947, the destroyer was anchored off Block Island, where severe weather would push her into grounding. The damage was, thankfully, fairly minimal. Small was refloated and moved to Boston for repair work, which would conclude by June of 1947. Following those repairs, Small returned to your typical peacetime work, training duty and fleet exercises primarily off the East Coast, with detours further afield sprinkled in. For example, on September 7th, 1947, Small sailed to Brazil, where she joined the escort for USS Missouri, carrying President Truman back home. The rest of the 1940s, past this point, was pretty uneventful. Small would bounce between the East Coast and Mediterranean, following a standard pattern for the time. This was hardly surprising, as naval matters during this period were generally quiet, until, of course, the decade ended and the 1950s began. With that change in decade came the Korean War. Now, this was primarily a land and air conflict. North Korea had no navy to speak of, and the Chinese were wise enough to keep their limited fleet home. That didn't mean, however, that naval forces were uninvolved. The UN forces had various fleets contribute to the conflict, primarily through aircraft carriers. Those carriers would, of course, need escort. USS Ernest G Small was one such escort. She sailed for Korea in the summer of 1950, transiting the Panama Canal on June 29th. From there, it was on to Korea, where the destroyer took up escort duty in addition to shore bombardment and patrolling off Taiwan, on the off chance that either Chinese government tried something funny there. Small would also support the landings at Incheon in September and Wonsan in October, although this largely consisted of just bombarding shore positions. These were successful landings. However, a couple months later, Small would also participate in a successful evacuation, this time getting the 10th Army Corps out of North Korea as the Chinese advanced. That was in December of 1950, and was the last excitement for the year. Small would then depart Korea, sailing to San Diego for a routine refit and overhaul. When that was done, the destroyer returned to Korea in the summer of 1951, for much the same duty as her first stint, escorting carriers and bombarding shore targets. This probably should have been quiet enough. Unfortunately, while bombarding Hungnam, Small would suffer severe damage, specifically on October 7th of 1951. While occupied in her bombardment duty, the destroyer struck a mine. This seriously damaged the bow just behind the foremost gun mount. It also killed 9 of the crew and wounded another 18. That was at least a minimal loss of life. The destroyer herself would suffer worse. While sailing for repair 4 days later, Small ran into heavy weather, with the result that, on October 11th, 1951, her bow snapped off. The pictures of that incident are striking, to say the least. Here you can see the bow breaking off, with the entire number 1 gun mount going along with it. And then the bow drifted off, still afloat, before capsizing and sinking away from the main hull. And yet, despite losing the entire bow ahead of the number 2 mount, Small remained afloat, although the ship had to sail in reverse back to Japan to avoid stressing her interior bulkheads. She would make it safely to port and was fitted with a temporary bow, a stubby little thing that reminds me of the false bow on USS Shaw after Pearl Harbor. This would allow Small to return home and receive a proper replacement. The battered destroyer arrived in Long Beach on December 18, 1951, where she was decommissioned on January 15th of 1952. Instead of building a new bow, the Navy did what they would later do with USS Kentucky and USS Wisconsin. They took the bow of an incomplete gearing, languishing in reserve, and lopped it off, before attaching it to USS Ernest G Small to fix her damage. That donor destroyer was USS Seymour D. Owens, which you might remember from the USS Norman Scott video. The destroyer named after Scott's fallen captain and never completed due to the end of the Pacific War. As for Small, she was converted to a radar picket ship, recommissioned with the new hull number DDR-838 on December 2nd, 1952. Small wouldn't return to combat off Korea, instead shifting to training off California, and then various peacetime patrols in the Far East, including off Taiwan. That'll become relevant later on. One of the more exciting moments there came in February of 1955. Small helped keep an eye on the situation in the Taiwan Strait during the first Taiwan Strait crisis. Then in May, she was present for underwater nuclear testing off the west coast. After this, Small returned to more traditional duty for the remainder of her American service. There was a break in 1959 under Air Force authority to support the Discoverer satellite program. However, beyond that, it was just your typical escort and training duty. Nothing major, but perfectly fine service. Small would receive her FRAM update at the end of 1960, but how long this work took and what the ship did after it is a bit of an open question. After 1960 until 1971, information becomes sparse. I've looked for more information on her service in the 60s, but there doesn't seem to be much published. For its part, NavSource indicates that Small remained in the Pacific, and that in 1965 she provided shore bombardment duty in Vietnam. But other than pictures and small blurbs, there's not much to go off there. If anyone has more information on this decade, by all means let me know. I'd be happy to follow up on it. For now, USS Ernest G. Small's story came to an end in 1971. The destroyer was transferred to Taiwan on April 13th, where the ship was recommissioned as ROCS Fuyang. I've seen reference to her serving as the flagship of Taiwan's fleet, but that's difficult to verify. As is, well, most of her service under that flag. If you watch my video on the Taiwanese submarines, you'll understand why. Not much has been written on the careers of American transfers. In Fuyang's case, she received a further modernization in the 1980s, where she then served on what I can only assume to be quiet, peacetime duty. Maybe the odd war scare with the PRC, but nothing particularly major or noteworthy that I can find. The veteran old destroyer would ultimately be decommissioned for the last time in December of 1999, and then sunk as a target on October 8th, 2003. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.